In late November, the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, celebrated its best ever performance in a Westminster election, pushing the Conservatives into third place in a by-election in Rotherham. This is the latest in a recent series of gains made by UKIP at the polls, sparking calls for an electoral pact with the Tories. Despite UKIP leader Nigel Farage now saying the party is a rising mainstream part of British politics, UKIP has long played up the fact that they are up against the status quo of the establishment. UKIP's recent success in harnessing people's growing disenchantment with the three mainstream parties also reflects a shift in right-wing politics in the UK and Europe. According to UKIP, their recent success in the polls is largely explained by the general public's discontent with the three main parties and mainstream politics in general. UKIP's press officer, Gawain Towler.
There is a great deal of dissatisfaction with the old-style establishment parties. They see very little to differentiate between the Conservatives, Lib Dems and Labour. They are the establishment, they are the elite. And so therefore people are looking at them with dissatisfaction and looking around for other options. Here is UKIP. It is untainted by those being part of the establishment.
Political experts and party representatives agree that there is a Britain and European-wide disillusionment with mainstream politics as parties have failed to address grievances born out of the economic crisis. The new Statesman's co-editor, Daniel Trilling.
There's a lot for people to be expressing their discontent about in Britain at the moment. There's a lot of discontent over the EU. There's a lot of discontent over the way that the Tories are running the country. And in fact, some right-wingers may feel that they're not being right-wing enough because they're in coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
By placing itself outside the mainstream, UKIP is able to harness this discontent. UKIP's original and principal platform was Britain's withdrawal from the EU. Then, their voting base was largely made up of white middle-class people of a certain age. But Gawain Towler says that broadening the scope of their policies has allowed them to reach out to a wider section of the public.
You just have to turn up at a UKIP meeting and see that the age range has changed dramatically. It's a much younger group. It's a much more professional group as well. Yes, we are strongest in the 65 and above, and yes, we are strongest in the lower social classes. However, that is changing. UKIP used to be demonised as just about Europe and just about immigration. As people realise we're about a lot of other things too, then our appeal broadens.
In the rest of Europe, disenchantment and political polarisation in a context of economic decline has led to a growth in movements aimed at capitalising on grassroots discontent. According to the think tank Demos, these seemingly populist movements are characterised by a greater coordination across national borders. They focus on values sometimes traditionally associated with the left, such as secularism, and exploit xenophobia. In Britain, the only far-right party with any weight is the British National Party, BNP, but it has not benefited from this climate. According to Simon Darby, the former deputy chairman of the BNP, this is largely due to the party's stigmatisation by the media.
The BBC, for instance, have a charter that compels them to treat people who've gained a significant portion of the vote with parity with other politicians, but that hasn't happened. Instead, the media have, in this country, the old establishment have decided that they don't like the British National Party because of what we say is very anti-establishment. So rather than give us a platform to talk about our policies and debate our policies, they've decided to try and put us out of business, basically.
Since its relative success in the 2008-2009 elections, the BNP has been so plagued by internal disputes that it is no longer a force to contend with. Furthermore, the party has never been able to shake off the stigma attached to their associations with racist and extremist views. Daniel Trilling again.
The BNP has failed to maintain the level of support that it had in 2008-2009. Since then, what's happened is that the BNP have been pushed back by a very successful anti-fascist campaign in Britain. As a result, the party has collapsed. I think the media has quite accurately pointed out that despite them offering policies that on the face of it sound fairly similar to those offered by other parties, underneath it the party is run by neo-Nazis.
The English Defence League has also been receiving media attention, but they are not considered a serious political force by the media or political experts. Indeed, they are not a political party, but a far-right, loosely organised protest movement established in 2009 to campaign against what it calls Islamic extremism. Their protests usually draw no more than a couple of hundred people, and according to Robert Ford from the University of Manchester, they suffer from the same lack of organisation and cohesiveness as the BNP. According to recent polls, 60% of the population still view them as a racist organisation, despite their best efforts to stress that they take issue with Islam and not Muslims in general. Dr. Robert Ford from the University of Manchester is a contributor to the Extremis project, an independent platform for research on extremism.
The survey data we have most recently on the EDL suggests that something like 50 or 60% of Britons do regard them as a racist organisation, despite their efforts to mobilise specifically around Islam rather than race, and most of those people would completely reject supporting the EDL. So it's not yet clear that if the EDL were to sort of switch to being a political party rather than a sort of direct action organisation, that they would break through politically, but they would have potentially less baggage on that front than the BNP did.
Overall, there has not been a cohesive far-right movement in Britain to harness general public discontent. Daniel Trilling from the New Statesman also credits a strong anti-racist movement in the 1970s and the 1980s for the failure of the far-right to find a foothold in the mainstream. Another obstacle currently faced by UKIP is Britain's electoral system. Dr. Robert Ford again.
You can't get elected to office at national level, and even it's very difficult at local level, on a far-right platform, because you're never going to win a majority of the voters in the district, and we have a first-past-the-post system. Those positions are held intensely by a section of the electorate, but that section is a minority. So it's very different to, say, Austria or Holland. They use a proportional system, so if you can win over sort of 5-10% of the electorate with intense views, then you win election to office.
Robert Ford adds that UKIP is very much to the right of the Conservatives.
The UKIP are quite a long way to the right of the Conservatives on a lot of issues. They want to withdraw from the EU altogether, of course. They want to reinstate the death penalty. The Conservatives don't support that. They want a total halt to immigration. The Conservatives don't support that. So on a lot of the key issues that seem to be encouraging voters towards them, the UKIP are a good way to the right.
As a party, it shares many values with other populist movements in Europe. In fact, UKIP and the BNP overlap on a number of platforms, and certain policies are worded similarly. But UKIP does not share the stigma attached to the BNP. The BNP's Simon Darby claims UKIP benefits from support across all sections of the press.
Leftist elements at the Guardian newspaper and the BBC wanting to hurt the Tories by promoting UKIP and then facilitating the disengagement of traditional Tory voters and a switch to UKIP. And on the other side of the spectrum, you've got right organisations like the Daily Telegraph, who are wishing to see Cameron take a harder line on Europe, actually promoting UKIP from that point of view as well.
Furthermore, according to Vidhya Ramalingam, project coordinator at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, UKIP benefits from levels of organisation and legitimacy that give it popular support.
So you need kind of political and media allies. You need to be able to distance yourself from extremism, from criminality. UKIP had, beyond its Eurosceptic platform, it's established itself as a kind of a leading anti-immigrant voice, and has, to some degree, been able to prove that it's not a racist party. And then in terms of public legitimacy, it has quite a few political and media allies. UKIP has had a number of defections from the Conservative Party that gives it a huge amount of legitimacy.
In fact, much like current popular radical right parties in Europe, UKIP has its origins rooted in more mainstream politics. Dr. Robert Ford again.
The BNP are a deeply illegitimate, stigmatised group. That's very different to some of the radical right parties we see elsewhere, who often started off campaigning on something other than immigration and then moved on to the immigration issue later, but no one ever questioned that they were a legitimate part of the political sphere. And UKIP has more in common with those kinds of parties in that respect.
Little has been made of UKIP's membership of the Eurosceptic political group called Europe of Freedom and Democracy. It includes the Italian Northern League, the Lithuanian Order and Justice Party, and other parties that are usually described as far-right and ultra-nationalist. Daniel Trilling says this is because the British media shows little interest in European politics. According to UKIP's Gawain Towler, this is just a strategic alliance.
We agree on issues of European integration and the euro. On everything else, we believe in national democracy. We do not feel the right to impose and instruct other countries how to live their life. The group that we have in the European Parliament has a range of parties with a range of points of view. It is a mixed bag, without a shadow of doubt. It is a marriage of convenience.
Many of the analysts I spoke to say UKIP's rising popularity isn't a sign of a significant shift to the right in Britain, but according to the think tank Demos, the right's focus on increasing immigration and the perceived threat from the growth of Islam in Europe have replaced the race-based views and anti-Semitism that previously characterised the far right. But does that mean that the right wing of politics has changed? Parties like UKIP reject the right-wing label, which they associate with old-style mainstream politics. Gawain Towler again.
I would say that right and left is a rather old-fashioned view. I think what we are now looking at is big and small. Big state, small individual. UKIP are very much the party of the big individual and the small state.
But ultimately, immigration regularly comes up as the main reason for the surge in support. Vidhya Ramalingam says there has been a shift within UKIP to broaden their support base and to adapt to the public mood.
So in recent years, there has been a shift within UKIP in terms of its ideology, and if you look at its key messages today, UKIP proposes, for example, an end to mass or uncontrolled immigration. They increasingly denigrate Islam, and these are all essential messages that the European radical right, if we can call it that, this kind of family of parties and movements that are uniting on similar causes, UKIP has started to adopt a number of those messages.
Alp Mehmet, vice chairman of the think tank Migration Watch, says high levels of immigration is an issue that resonates with 70% of the population and is at the forefront of the general public's concerns.
Immigration has consistently been one of the major issues of concern to the electorate. It's remained up there with the economy as one of the issues that people believe is sufficiently important for the government to devote attention to.
Migration Watch say that the coalition government hasn't addressed this. Alp Mehmet says that the media has downplayed negative effects of high levels of immigration.
Thinking back now to the sort of advice coming out of the Treasury, that was that immigration had no downside, it was only an upside. But with regard to the media, up until really quite recently, they were downplaying the seriousness of high levels of immigration.
But according to many political experts, including the Institute for Public Policy Researcher Sarah Mulley, Migration Watch are not so much an independent think tank as a pressure group or right-wing lobby who want to halt immigration.
I think it's clear that they are promoting a particular position in the debate, and they have a very clear objective, which is to reduce net immigration to the UK substantially, and I think preferably down to zero would be their position. And the reports and the media work which they do is in line with that specific objective.
Many media outlets have called on Migration Watch to supply them with data and figures. The other factor that has bolstered UKIP's standing is a prevailing negative attitude to Islam. Again, there has been a noticeable rise in anti-Islam discourse in the media that has entered the mainstream. The New Statesman's Daniel Trilling.
The reason why parties will benefit from anti-Islam rhetoric is because that anti-Islam sentiment is present within wider society. It's something that's endorsed by the mainstream media and mainstream politicians. The excuse that it's not racist if you only focus on religion really doesn't hold up when you look at the tone and the rhetoric of some of the things that are being said about Islam.
Sensing the public mood, talk of Islam and Muslims has become much more central to UKIP's policies. The original founder of the UK Independence Party, Alan Sked, famously resigned the leadership in 1997 because of the party's flirting with the far right. During the last election, he accused the party of focusing on issues such as the burqa while the country faced the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. The references to Islam as a faith have allowed parties and pressure groups to denounce the pitfalls of immigration without being labelled as racist. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue's Vidhya Ramalingam.
Concerns about Muslims and different forms of Islamophobia are increasingly represented in mainstream political debates in Britain. And so it is acceptable these days for parties to pick up on that and to use an Islamophobic political platform and not be accused of being racist. And this has been something that UKIP has also been able to fall into.
The British notion of multiculturalism is blamed for encouraging negative views of ethnic minorities. But both Robert Ford and Daniel Trilling disagree and say that the British model has in fact had more harmonious results than other models of integration in Europe, such as the French one.
I think actually Britain's approach to a multicultural society has had some notable successes, and one of those is actually allowing people the freedom to worship and the freedom to identify as groups.
Vidhya Ramalingam says the reason the right have gained from the current climate at the expense of the left is that the latter haven't been able to communicate solutions in ways that resonate with people coping with the consequences of the economic downturn.